Hello, and welcome to Other Voices, produced by the Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. You know him as the longtime director of the Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. You've seen him at countless demonstrations, usually our master of ceremonies. For decades, he's made sure that people on the Mid-Peninsula have an opportunity to raise their voices together for peace and justice, be it in rallies at Palo Alto City Hall, or be it in front of Congressmember Eshu's office in downtown, or be it in monthly live forums or taped forums right here at the Media Center, where Other Voices is one of the longest running programs that this Media Center has ever been associated with since 1996. Tonight, I'm your guest host, Elliot Margulies, from the Midpen Media Center. And I am wanting to help us all find out what makes Paul George tick. And this is called the Exit Interview because he's led the Peace and Justice Center for 30 years, and now he's retiring. Collective gasp? You've already done that, I assume. Yeah, I've seen the emails. Now, this is our opportunity to know him a little differently than we do normally when he's standing in front of us with a bullhorn. So you can help me with some of the questions that we send to Paul, and I had the benefit of a little discussion the other day, so I sort of know a few stories, and I'd like to begin way back, way before he knew there was ever going to be a peace center in his life. And how does a pet shop figure into your first taste of radicalism?
Well, and thank you for doing this, Elliot. I really appreciate it. I've been waiting 26 years to see what the view is from this side of the table. It's not bad. Well, when I was 16, and I'll just preface this quickly with, I had always been a news junkie, is the term I use. I had started reading newspapers pretty young. I followed the news. I followed international affairs and politics. I don't know why. It's just always interested me. And in the early and mid 60s, Vietnam was, appearing in the newspaper more and more, devoid of context, explanation, or reason or anything. And I was trying to figure out why the heck we're there. The only thing I could get out of my father was because they're communists. And that I didn't find satisfactory. Well, I knew about the Gene McCarthy for President campaign. He ran, just to remind people, in 1968, he ran against an incumbent president of his own party, which we might hope will happen again this year, solely on the platform of bring the troops home from Vietnam now, just come home. And he was getting tremendous notice about it. One day, coming home from school in Westmont, New Jersey, which is where I lived, what had been a pet shop for many years, my family had bought pets at this pet shop, was suddenly a Gene McCarthy for President campaign office. So I stopped in, looked at their materials, spent the afternoon talking to people who were only a few years older than me that were staffing the office. And I started hearing the answers that I had been searching for about what it meant for our country to be in Vietnam, why we were really there. And that's how the pet shop became a significant...
And who owned this pet shop?
This is a really interesting story because this is also, in addition to learning from these people, the other staffers there, which I became one of that day, the pet shop had actually been a retirement project of a guy by the name of John Tisa. And John Tisa was first a veteran of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, the people who had gone to fight the fascists in Spain. And he was a very well-known union organizer. Right near my town of Westmont was Camden, New Jersey, where Campbell Soup was based, the biggest manufacturer. John Tisa was responsible for unionizing Campbell Soup. It was an epic struggle. So this guy really knew what he was doing. He would come by 2 or 3 days a week in the evenings and just tell stories. And he was telling the stories to educate us. Through those stories, we learned how to organize, how to talk to people that we don't agree with, and things like that. It was just a terrific education. And,
do you remember one? One of his stories?
Not that I can repeat on TV. This was a very guy-heavy operation, actually. There were a bunch of teenage boys in there, so some of his stories were geared for teenage boys. I don't specifically remember any of the stories, but he told a lot about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and more about his efforts in the Union, because he was eventually driven from the Union because they thought he was too far left and radical. And that's when he finally retired and opened up the pet shop.
So at this point, you're 16 years old,
Yeah.
right?
Uh-huh.
And it's a far cry to this McCarthy headquarters from the American Legion that you used to frequent, right? How did the American Legion figure in?
Well, that was my dad. He was a veteran of World War II and was very active in the American Legion. And it happened that the American Legion posts that he was active with sponsored the big annual 4th of July celebration in our area for all the towns around our area. And they would set up at the high school football stadium and a big stage and everything. And so starting at a really young age, I was always helping with setting up for the 4th of July. That's where I learned some event organizing, the things that you need to do. You have to have the sound system, the stage, crowd control, all this other stuff.
And I imagine if we were flies on the wall at your dinner table when you're coming back from the McCarthy headquarters, there's a little tension in the air, maybe?
There was some tension. My entire family, not just my immediate family, but the cousins and uncles and grandparents, everybody, were dyed-in-the-wool Republicans. Just absolutely. So the best way I explain it, if maybe TD can, in the control room, can bring up one of the pictures. We've got some historic photos that are going to be coming up here. So this is me as a Boy Scout, and what I wanted to say is my father always wanted a Boy Scout, and I went to Boy Scouts and I had a good time, but he actually ended up getting Sergeant Pepper. That is me at 16, by the way.
Very good. Now, yeah. So,
But,
yeah.
And so my mother ended up playing peacemaker a lot. So, and it came to the point where I would go up in the morning during the summer when I was on school vacation and go very early in the morning to the campaign office and either not come home and stay in the office or come home and very late at night just to avoid these confrontations, because by this point I knew he was wrong.
So kind of like many 16-year-old teenagers, you were forging a path that was a little bit divergent from your family roots.
It was a lot divergent.
Yeah, I think a lot of us probably had that experience, but yours was around politics, being a news junkie from what, age 12 or something?
Yeah, maybe even a little before then, yeah.
So just to take us a little further along the timeline, because we want to eventually get to the Peace and Justice Center, but there's other chapters along the way. Paul decides to move to Washington, D.C. for college and attends American University. And at this point, it's 1969, and we are in the thick of anti-war activity and demonstrations. And you mentioned something about tear gas and...
There was one series of demonstrations that especially took off after Kent State happened in the spring of 1970. There were demonstrations all year. I attended the first Vietnam moratorium in November when 1 million people descended on Washington. I had never seen anything like it, and I was really inspired by that. But after Kent State, those of us who were working on anti-war activities, we got, there's a lot of universities in Washington, D.C., and American University, where I was going to school, sat on Massachusetts Avenue. It's a main thoroughfare into downtown. Catholic University was in the northeast of the city, and they also sat on a major thoroughfare. Georgetown and George Washington were downtown at bridges that came into town. So we came up with this plan that we were going to shut down the war machine by going out and shutting down the streets and just not letting the war machine get to work. Melvin Laird, the Secretary of Defense at the time, always drove by our school in his limousine on the way by, and he was in the traffic that we stopped. But the police, just because of people like Melvin Laird being held up, and he was not going to take back streets. He wanted that street cleared. So we were on a traffic circle on Massachusetts Avenue, so it was an intersection of a couple of major streets. And we were just occupying that circle. So we were actually blocking like 3 or 4 different streets. And just this huge phalanx of police came in and started clearing the streets. And this is the first time I got billy clubbed. The crowd is pressing up, trying to get to the side, and I'm at the back of the crowd, and there's a cop behind me poking me in the back with his billy club. And I turned and said, "Please, officer, I am moving as fast as I can." And he just went whap right across my face. And about the only thing I remember is being dragged away, and then some time later, somebody showing up with my glasses that had gone flying. I was grateful for that, because at the time I couldn't see anything without my glasses. Yeah, they were shooting tear gas all over the place, just indiscriminately, not just at this intersection, but way back onto campus, so that tear gas is actually a powder, and it'll settle into the ground. So days later, you could be walking across the field at AU and get gassed all over again because you're stirring up all the powder in the grass.
I remember, like in some sense, there was a feeling like they're not, the Melvin Lairds and the Richard Nixons aren't really hearing or caring. But I don't know, being in D.C. and in the middle of all those demonstrations, did it feel more hopeful, or how did it feel?
I wouldn't say hope was a part of it at this time, because the hope came from ever-increasing numbers at these demonstrations. American University went out on strike, and we had teach-ins out on the quad and all that sort of thing. And that drew more people in, so that each time we went out to demonstrate, there were more people. So that you could physically see. The politicians, the Melvin Lairds and the Richard Nixons, they didn't feel like part of the society, let alone what we were dealing with. I actually saw Richard Nixon for the, I guess it would have been the '72 inauguration. We were living in Washington at the time. And he's standing up outside of the limousine, waving. He didn't look real. He looked, I know he was made up for TV and stuff, but he didn't look real. And one of the interesting things is my wife Barb at the time was working at Sears, and she had to work that day, so I was downtown at all the demonstrations around this inauguration. When I saw her at home later that evening, she said, "Yeah, we were watching it on TV at the," she was a switchboard operator, so she could watch TV. She She said, but I didn't understand why everybody was cheering so loud. And I said, cheering? The whole crowd on Pennsylvania Avenue was going, fuck you, fuck you.
It's like the, what was the, those record albums with the principal? Help me out. The funny, yeah, Fireside Theater, and the principal is talking, and they're saying, eat it raw. And he's going, rah, rah, rah. Anyway, so I'm going to move us a little ahead.
Sure.
So as Paul mentioned, he got married to Barb, and they had a child who's now a grown man here tonight, Sean. And they decide
He's been
after
doing the graphics on this program for all 26 years.
So I better mind my P's and Q's. They decide after a few years post-graduation at American to move to the West Coast and relocate in Berkeley. And, oh, there we have
there's Sean,
yeah. You need to tell me what we're
yes.
seeing, and I'll stop. But at any rate, they were influenced a little by Quaker landlords. Paul was active in a single-payer campaign. But I want to move up to something that really impacted Paul politically and just in his own development as a person. And those were your visits to El Salvador and Nicaragua in 1989 and 1990. So we have skipped ahead some.
Yeah.
But those are very moving visits. And in particular, I wonder if you could preface with this village of refugees and what your purpose was.
Yeah, I went to this village in El Salvador, Segundo Montes, 3 times. I also went in '91. And the people in Ciudad Segundo Montes, by the way, was one of the priests who was assassinated at the university in San Salvador. The town was named for him. The people that lived there were from different villages all around this area, and they had fled earlier in the 80s because of the massacres that the army was, the Salvadoran army was engaged in. It was a deliberate policy of terrorizing the population. They called it draining the fish to get to the sea, because the people, draining the sea to get to the fish. This is one of the reasons I'm retiring.
You have a sympathetic ear. Here, it doesn't hear too well, but...
But while they were in the refugee camp in Mexico, they developed a very collective way of living together. They developed their own industries, like weaving hammocks and knitting socks, and doing some like egg farming and chicken farming and stuff to earn some money. And they had a fully democratic process for choosing their own leadership and everything. Fascinating structure. And they came to the conclusion that they might actually serve as a positive example for the rest of the people in El Salvador. And unknown in history, as far as anybody can ever tell, they returned to where they had left while the war was still going on to try to provide this example. No group of refugees has ever been known to return while the war was still going on from when they had left. So a good part of these visits was to go out there. They were in the very eastern part, and just to the south was a major government army base, and just to the north was a major rebel base, the FMLN. And they were right in the middle of the conflict. So they wanted a constant international presence there to kind of protect them, and especially Americans, because we were financing the war. And so the army kind of figured, you know, hands off the tourists, the American tourists. They knew we were there as solidarity workers. They didn't trust us, but they didn't mess with us too much. So that was the purpose of the trip. And the story that struck me so much, just listening to all their stories. I mean, I heard hundreds of tales of what these people have been through. But on one of the trips, I'll start with, you know, Karl Marx said history repeats itself first. tragedy and then as farce. This one I start with farce and I move into the tragedy. Before you could travel out to the east, to the conflictive zone, as they called it, you had to, in the capital, go up to the military high command and get a safe conduct pass. You had to be interviewed, and they would give you a pass so you could go out to the war zone. While we were waiting there for our interviews, this limousine pulls up, and a couple of Americans get out dressed in suits. I could see one, his jacket flew open, and he had guns under his shoulders. And coming striding out just then from the military high command was Elliot Abrams, who has just been appointed to be in charge of Venezuela. And he was in charge of Central America, so this repression, this massacre of civilians out in the eastern part occurred under his administration.
He's part of the State Department?
He was a special envoy from the State Department, and following behind him was the U.S. ambassador to El Salvador, William Walker. Well, as soon as we saw Elliot Abrams, we're jumping up, and, Mr. Abrams, we want to talk to you, we want to talk to you. He just went like a bee right to the limousine through the door that was being held open for him. So then along comes the ambassador, and we're, Mr. Ambassador, can you talk to us? He actually started to hesitate and come our way, and then realized, I can't talk to these people, they're solidarity activists. And he goes rushing off to the limousine, leaps into the car through the same door that Elliot Abrams had just gotten in, and they get all tangled up and fall out of the car like a Keystone Cops thing. That's the farce. When I got out to the east, then I saw the tragedy of Elliot Abrams and U.S. policy, because we went to the site of the El Mozote massacre, which was right near Ciudad Segundo Montes. It was about a 2-mile hike away. And it's remained abandoned since the massacre there, which was, I believe, 84, when hundreds, I think it was 800 people in the area total, 1,000 were killed. One of the very few survivors, Rufina Amaya, was there in El Mozote with us that day. And we just stood in the middle of the street while she told the story. And you can hear it still moves me.
Sure.
To see firsthand the results of these policies that we intellectualize here, you can't beat it.
What did you see? Or what did you
hearing her
remember
story,
hearing? Yeah.
literally I saw right in the same area a school bombed out. It was half caved in, it was all blown up. I used to come back and do slideshows to talk about El Salvador and what was going on. One of my slides was a plaque on the side of this school, a gift from the American people as part of the, what was it for progress? Alliance for Progress, yes. John F. Kennedy, hanging there on this dilapidated building. I saw the long-term effects on the children who grow up in a thing like this. We were observing in Segunda Montes, they had no classroom, so the kids took classes outside. And we had been observing classes, and we were walking back to the village for lunch, and I was walking along with about a 7 or 8-year-old boy, and our translator was with us, so I could kind of talk with him. And suddenly we could hear aerial bombardment just over the hill from where we were. And us visitors were all freaked out, and he just cocks his head and goes like this, you know, 500-pound bombs. He was so used to war, knew so much about it, because that was his only life. And that really struck home to me about what these policies are. You need to keep in mind, you know, that there's real people that have actual lives and real suffering from our policies, and they aren't just debated on the evening news. And I think a lot of people that support, oh yeah, let's go in and get Venezuela, you know, no, that's going to cause a lot of suffering. That's why we can't ever get behind a U.S. invasion, no matter how critical the human rights situation might be. A, we have no business doing it, and B, we don't do it right.
I imagine neither the young boy, who now is probably 30s, in his 30s,
Yeah.
and nor Rufino know that you carry them so close to your heart
Yeah.
even now.
I was in touch with someone who stayed in touch with Rufina for a long time, but then when she left that line of work and actually came to work at the Peace and Justice Center for a while.
Really?
Yes. Yeah, the
Wow.
person who led our delegation, I was so impressed with her that when she got tired of all the traveling, she was living back in Washington, and we needed an assistant director. So she came out from Washington to join us here, Christy Rogers.
And so she knew what happened to Rufina.
Yeah, she stayed in touch with a lot of those people for a long time. Eventually, she did lose touch, but that was why Rufina came out. It was very painful for her to tell this story. She lost her own children, 3 kids, and her husband, and she had to tell the story. And she told it many times to different delegations going down there, because she knew we would come back and tell her story for her.
So it imprinted, and I'm going to move into your role back here,
Yeah.
which is how we've all been, how we're all here in this room, because in many ways you've given us a joint voice, a joint way to be together. And so I wonder, you know, in your role as head of the Peace Center, starting in 1989 and again in 95 and up till this month, you've dealt with our Congress people.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned something that was almost 180 degrees different from Ambassador Walker and definitely Elliott Abrams in connection with the Republican Tom Campbell.
Yeah.
Can you bring us back to that?
When I first started at the Peace Center, Tom Campbell was our representative here, moderate Republican. They used to exist. It's a term that meant something back then. And so we had, you know, done the whole thing with Tom about, in terms of El Salvador. As I mentioned, the U.S. was financing that war, and Congress was the ones that were appropriating that money. And we knew that another vote would be coming up soon to renew the financing for the coming year for El Salvador. So we were really kind of campaigning focused on Tom. We had demonstrations at his office. There was one where we took over his office, occupied his office with body bags and lots of people and stuff. And all the typical things you do as a grassroots activist: petition campaigns, letter writing campaigns, phone the congressman. And he finally gave me a one-on-one meeting, and it was a really interesting meeting. A lot of meetings with elected representatives are them kind of protecting their position. He was really exploring this idea with me. Now, it helped that he was a devout Catholic, was educated with the Jesuits, and the assassination of the Jesuits at the university in San Salvador had deeply affected him. But I think he listened to the tales of those of us who had been down there. And this is one of my great victories, a few, doing this kind of work. But when the vote came up that year, Tom Campbell was one of only 5 Republicans to vote no on aid to El Salvador. And the pushback was so great at that time that the aid actually got halved. They only went to, they cut, I don't remember what the figure was anymore, but they cut it in half. As kind of a compromise. I guess the compromise is we'll only kill half as many people this coming year.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think another success is your relationship with Congresswoman Eshoo.
Yeah, it got off to a kind of a rough start because Anna had just been elected, just been sworn in, and Bill Clinton had just been elected and sworn in. One of the first things Bill Clinton did in his first month in office, in January of '93, I guess is when he would have taken office, was he unleashed a bombing run against Iraq, blew up some of downtown Baghdad, including killing Iraq's leading artist, this woman painter who was known the world over, and she was killed in this bombing. Well, I was driving in my car and I'm hearing news about this bombing, and then they quote Anna Eshoo saying she supports the president in this action. Now, she had been in office like a week, you know, and she's a freshman and she's got a president of her own party. I kind of understood that, but we couldn't let it slide. So very shortly, by that evening, we had a demonstration out in front of her office, and a lot of people were there. The next day, I get a phone call that Anna would like to meet with me. So I went down, and again, it was just the two of us. And the first words from my new congresswoman were, "Paul, I don't want the peace movement pissed off at me." And I said, "Anna?" Well, I didn't call her Anna then. I said, "Congresswoman, don't support bombing other countries. It's easy." And she hasn't.
You mentioned that she didn't even need to use that in a speech at one point, but still.
She, when it came time to vote against this latest Gulf War, Iraq War, the vote was actually in 2002. We had an intense campaign going on with her. So many people were calling her office at our urging. Her chief of staff called me and said, "Paul, can you can you get them to stop calling? We can't keep up with the phone calls." And I said, "I'm sorry, Karen, my job is to get people to call you. Your job is to answer the phone." But so before that vote, Anna called me actually from the congressional cloakroom before she went out to vote to assure me that she was going to vote no. And what she said on the phone was what I would have said at a rally. She really got it. It was an unprovoked war. We don't do it. It's against international law. It's immoral. She had it really good. When she went to run again for office in 2004, she put that speech on her campaign material on the outside. She didn't hide it. It was no longer an issue. You know, she didn't even have to talk about the Iraq War. It was a done deal. So I really congratulate her on that. The only place we've really not seen very eye to eye is on various trade issues. We had an epic campaign against NAFTA with her, and she ended up voting for it. Again, I think it was the freshman kind of thing, because she wasn't going to buck a president of her own party. But yeah, she's been a good representative and has been very generous of her time, not only with me, but with other representatives and organizations in the area. Usually a number of organizations will go meet with her at one time.
So the NAFTA campaign, anti-NAFTA to be exact, you had the Anti-Citizens United campaign.
Yeah, she came to that. That was interesting. That was, again, a coalition effort, a bunch of different activists. One of them is sitting over there, Debbie Mytels. We got together. There was this movement called Move to Amend to try to get an amendment to the Constitution, say money is not speech, and corporations are not people. They don't have rights like under the Constitution, which they do in terms of the courts right now. And we thought it'd be great to try to educate Anna on this and have a town hall and have her come and listen. And so we got some good speakers. She agreed to come. We filled up and overfilled Lucy Stern amphitheater or a ballroom, 300 or 400 people, and then out into the hallway. And then when she got up to address the crowd at the end, she said, "I support this constitutional amendment." And we're all like,
Now, in 2003, the Palo Alto Weekly said that the largest ever demonstration on the peninsula had happened against the war in Iraq, or the going to be war in Iraq. And maybe many of us in the room were part of it that night. I'm wondering what it felt like to you. Can you remember that night?
Well, it was during the day. It was.
It
was on a Saturday. It was February 1st, actually, 2003. We did it as a building for. I guess it was the following week when tens of millions around the globe marched against it, and we took 6 or 8 busloads up to San Francisco for that march. But for the week before, to kind of build up for that, so that whole period was just. It's like an intense blur, but One of my favorite things was, and this tells you how pre-internet this was. We had internet and email, but not everybody was on there. We went out and printed up thousands of door hangers that had in big red, "No war," and then information about the rally. And I remember driving home from the center one day, and just every door, we had hundreds of volunteers come and get some of these door hangers, and we just papered the entire area. Good old-fashioned shoe leather, grassroots organizing, and driving home and seeing all these door hangers saying "No war" as I was driving home was great. But
I mean, you hosted so many demonstrations. I'm wondering, is it like having a party and not knowing how many people are going to show up, and then all of a sudden there's this mass?
There is that element to it. I had a pretty good sense that this was going to be a big one. I've been working with the police department for a long time, negotiating a march route with the police department that's on a limited, just had budget cuts. So that every block they see dollar signs, and I'm seeing more people joining us in the streets. Anyway, I knew it was going to be pretty big, but when, I don't know if you remember Don Kazak at the Palo Alto Weekly, but he said the weekly reporters and the publisher were all out there. And they had kind of decided on the spot that we had 5,000 people there in front of Palo Alto City Hall, more than 10% of the population at the time. And that it was the largest demonstration, any kind of protest demonstration in the history of the peninsula. And it remains that way to this day. Although the teenagers who I interviewed on this program last year who organized the March for Our Lives in Redwood City came pretty close to eclipsing my record. If they had done that, I wouldn't have had them on the program.
There's got to be some limits.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And you mentioned also
but be humble.
the minimum wage campaign. That's not that long ago.
That's right.
Why that might have been a little different than some of the other things you've worked on.
Well, unlike so much of what we do, where we often lose the vote in Congress, or it's not even something tangible to begin with, we're just talking about inequality. Well, I'm not going to see inequality overcome in my lifetime, I don't think, maybe. But raising the minimum wage, which is the responsibility, California has a set minimum wage and the federal government has a set minimum wage, and you can't go under those. But an individual town can go above it. And so working with people that came out of the Occupy Mountain View group and other groups around the area, we decided best way to address economic inequality, which leads directly to political inequality, but that's a speech that I give. One thing that we could do to directly affect inequality is try to raise the minimum wage. And so we started in Mountain View and found receptive people on the city council, and lo and behold, they passed a new minimum wage. And the next week I set up a meeting with a couple of city council people from Palo Alto, and they said, yeah, we'll go for it, and they introduced it. We ended up getting an increase in the minimum wage from, at the time, I think it was around $10 or something, to $15 an hour in incremental steps over the last few years. So this was a really, truly tangible thing that we accomplished that actually did some direct, measurable good for people in our community.
Absolutely.
So that's why that'll be a memorable one.
So from 16-year-old Sergeant Pepper and Gene McCarthy, a volunteer, to retiring Paul George from 30 years of leading the Peace Center. You said yourself, it's not the easiest work because there's a lot of people pulling all of us the other direction in our lives, and I'm wondering,
our own supporters are pulling me 6 different directions.
But what keeps you?
This is the peace movement.
Smiling? What keeps you enthusiastic? What keeps you from quitting 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
Because I can look at what this country was like in 1919 and look at what it's like in 2019, and then for all our problems right now, I'll tell you, this is a much better country than it was 100 years ago. It's better because we had a strong union movement and a strong civil rights movement and women's movement, environmental movement. None of those things came from the government and the elected officials down. Those were all grassroots from the bottom up movements. And that's what improved, really improved people's lives in this country. Protected their safety and health and things like that. So that's what keeps me going, is knowing, and I think people, I try to stress this when I give a talk somewhere, and that's one of my favorite things to do, by the way, is give talks. So if you want to hire me after I retire, I'm available for birthdays and bar mitzvahs. But I try to remind people of this history because it can get so discouraging, especially now with this evil clown in the White House. But that we do manage somehow to continue moving forward despite steps back. We make more steps forward, and it's us that do it, that does it. The grassroots, the people like you who go and hang those door hangers on hundreds of doors around Palo Alto, who come to events like this and listen to speakers and learn and go out and talk to your neighbors about it. That's how real progress is made. And so, you know, if you lose this week, it's easy to come back next week because eventually the victory will be there. We'll make some little gain in justice or in inequality or whatever, because that's what history tells us happens. We haven't seen any major reversals. We've just seen slow but steady progress. And it's not easy. I've really always taken to heart the words of the great orator and former slave Frederick Douglass, who said, "Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did and it never will." Well, he said that back in the 1800s, and that's still true. We need to be out there making those demands constantly, and that's why it's been very satisfying, and that's why I stay hopeful for the future, and whatever work is going to be in the future, I can get up and go back to work each day joyously, because it's a joyous thing to pursue.
So on a joyous note, I want to invite all of you to share an image you have of Paul or an appreciation you have of him after these 30 years at the Peace and Justice Center. Or if you want to follow up on something he said and go a little deeper with him, just raise your hand and Steffi will come over to you. I did forget. Go ahead and raise your hand. I'm going to fill the time with one detail.
I'm going to fill the time just briefly. If Steffi would stand up and she'll be coming around with the microphone. Steffi is my partner, the love of my life, and she's also the president of the board of directors at the Peace and Justice Center. And I want to take this opportunity to say it's not me that's done all this over these years. It's all the people in this room and the people on our board. Wendy is here. I don't think we have any other board members here tonight. Wendy, wave your hand. Oh, and Paul is way in the back. Paul Gilbert. Thank you. And we've had lots of board members. Steffi was volunteering at the center when I started there 30 years ago, so we've been good friends for that long. She's been on the board since '95 and has been the president, I think, since 2004, 2005, something like that. So you owe as much to Steffi, who you never see except when she's coming around with the microphone, as you do to me or anybody else who's visible up on that stage. So come up with some good questions for her to hold a mic for.
And I just wanted to go back because there's something that Paul had in his shoes. Not tonight, but going back to his visit to El Salvador. And I think we should all know about what was in your shoe besides your foot.
It wasn't actually in my shoes.
Oh, okay. Where was it?
I built in a false bottom
right.
to my suitcase. On one of these trips to Segunda Montes, there was a very large group of Salvadoran refugees right here in the area, and they were organized and they were trying to fundraise for Segunda Montes and other causes in El Salvador. And the Peace Center and I individually did a lot of work with them, helped them with some of the fundraising. So when they knew I was coming down, they asked to meet, and they said, "Paul, would you take some money down for us?" I said, "Yeah, how much?" $10,000. What do I do at the border? You don't say anything. You need to smuggle this in. So I smuggled in $10,000 to El Salvador.
Can we bring up the music from Man from U.N.C.L.E.? You didn't know that your Peace and Justice Center director was an international
crime. The next year, this is even more interesting. A health workers group got together, and they asked me to take some supplies down for some medical clinics in the capital. So the following year, I smuggled in 2,000 condoms.
So on that note, does anybody have an image of Paul that they want to share?
Questions or comments?
I do have a question, which is that on May 3rd, 1971, I was one of 7,000 people arrested in Washington, D.C. It sounds like the same thing you're talking about. Is it?
It is. I was not arrested that day, but...
Well, you were lucky.
Yeah.
Even if you did have the policeman poking you.
Yeah.
So that was a very interesting experience.
Were you housed at RFK Stadium?
I was not one of them. I was in the D.C. jail recreation area. Go through this very small door, and there were 800 people when I walked in there. One time we had 1,600 people, and they were trying to get us out during the night because they didn't want the news media showing that we were there overnight. I was one of the last ones to leave, and it was just getting light.
Wow.
But it was a life-changing experience.
Yeah. I had kind of the opposite effect at one time when on a civil disobedience arrest out at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. They didn't want to let us out. We were arrested very early on a Friday morning. We were sitting in the driveway to stop the workers from getting into the plant to design nuclear weapons. And they took us out to Santa Rita, and they were hoping we would what's called cite out. You'd sign a citation and promise to show up. Everybody refused to cite out and to give our names, just to kind of clog up the system and make sure nobody got treated unfairly. And so they'd originally, I was among the first 5 or 10 people that got arrested, so they put us in general population and said, "You're the only ones." And then eventually they came and got us and said, "Well, there are some more," and they took us over to the gym, and there were 500 people in the gym. But they have 72 hours to arraign you, 72 business hours. So we were arrested early Friday morning. They brought a judge out to the jailhouse Tuesday evening at 5 o'clock to arraign us and finally let us out. So they held us for 5 days without even being charged. They were trying to tell us not to come back. Yeah, they were trying to make it a miserable experience so we would never do it again.
Did you?
Yeah, sure.
Surprise. Does anybody want to ask a question? Well then, yes, there we are.
Okay.
I've said this to Paul before, but he kept me sane. There was a point at the beginning of this century that I was in terrible despair and I thought I was going to go crazy. And thanks to his work and his wonderful support for the community and keep us going, I'm still here.
I think that's one of the big roles that the Peace Center plays, because I think we all help keep each other's spirits up. One story I thought of after we met and kind of talked about this, but that was really neat. It happened 2 or 3 times. We would be having a protest somewhere, and it's usually like from 5 to 7. And in the run-up to the Gulf War, we did a lot of protests just up at El Camino and Embarcadero and things like that. And because of the time and the interest in the story, we would often have TV news crews there, and they would broadcast live on their evening broadcast. They would be interviewing me and broadcasting live. 2 or 3 times after that broadcast went, about 15 minutes later, a bunch of new people showed up at the corner, and they would come up and say, I was sitting home watching TV. I thought I was the only one feeling this way. I was so relieved to see somebody else out here. And I think that's one of the most important things we can do for each other, and that's one of the most important things that a place that has a permanent presence in a community like the Peace Center can do. You are not alone in feeling that something is not right.
We were talking earlier about this experiment using Facebook and how many people you don't even know might be tuning in. And there may be a 16-year-old out there right now who you're his John Tisa, at least tonight. So
I would be honored to be considered to be somebody's John Tisa. We have had interns at the Peace and Justice Center, and in fact, one of them even got paid because we had some money at the time we brought her on board. And the 2 ones who really were the most promising and worked the hardest continue to work in social justice to this day, all these years later, and are still good friends.
And in doing this show, I don't know if you've ever counted the number that you've produced here, usually in this seat. What are a couple of the standout memories of people you've had interviewing here?
There have been a lot of really good people. There was a surprising one. I never thought I would meet, let alone interview, a former United States Senator, but Mike Gravel was on this program, and he's still out there. I just noticed in the paper the other day stirring things up because he's still a strict anti-interventionist. He was one of the first to oppose the Vietnam War. He didn't really have anything going on. I just wanted him on the show because of his history and what an interesting guy he was. And it was a fun interview. And people like Chris Field and Catherine Mock, scientists over at Stanford who headed up the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These are the scientists who are driving the debate. I've been guests on this show twice. I really appreciated getting them and learning from them. It's been wonderful. And all kinds of journalists and activists, of course. But I think of all of those, and I don't know how many it is, once a month for
20-odd years.
22 years. I can't do the math. I'd have to get my...
It's a lot of times 12. That's beyond my multiplication
That's
tables.
a lot of shows. But I think I can honestly say the one that really stands out and was my favorite was the one I did last year with 3 of the teenage organizers of the March for Our Lives rally in Redwood City last year that I mentioned earlier that almost broke my record for biggest protest. The police told them they had 4,000 people there. It was a great protest. Steffi and I had gone. And to have them on the show and talking with them before the show, seeing their energy and commitment, that's another thing that gives me great hope for the future. And on that note about hope for the future, I do draw a lot of hope from the level of activism that has kind of welled up since Trump's election. And I know a lot of people are focused on electoral work, and that's important. It's got to be done. But there's a reason I've chosen grassroots work, and because that's ongoing. Whoever's in office, we need the grassroots making to concede making demands to concede from power. But we all know this, but I think it's significant for the future that so many people who will readily tell you, I've never been active before, are active now, and I just hope that we can find the ways to keep them involved, even if this current guy is a one-term president. That will be the challenge. The most challenging times for the Peace Center has been when we've had a Democratic president, because people think, oh, no problem now. Yeah, no. No matter who it is, there's always something to be debated and a better position to be taken. So we do need to stay active. But that gives me a lot of hope when I see these new groups springing up. And now it's not just the Peace and Justice Center that's doing demonstrations out on, coming up on this Thursday. I know most people are going to see this on tape, but there's going to be a bunch of demonstrations on the Mueller report. That's not us. It's all these new people doing that this time around. More power to them.
So we're about to say goodnight, and as Paul mentioned, he'll be back in this chair next month and maybe another 20, 30 years, hopefully. And
we'll be doing Medicare for all.
Okay, Medicare for all in a month. So keep coming. You're not losing this this TV star. You're just losing his day-to-day guidance of the center. And what else is on your program? Not Other Voices program, on your life program, on the bucket list?
Well, I do want to
We only have 1 minute.
Okay.
So your bucket list
very
has
quickly,
to be manageable.
Elliot is responsible for this program because he's the one that approached me in '96 and suggested we do something over here. So thank you, Elliot, for that. My own bucket list is to stay active, but just in different forms. One of the things I tell people is I'm not really retiring. I'm just retiring from fundraising, which. But like I said before we went on air, I want to do some writing, maybe podcasting, some more video work. TD and I have talked about doing some video stuff. And I will be out at the demonstrations. I just won't be the guy up on the stage.
You'll be hanging those door hangers.
That's right.
Let's give him a applause and appreciation.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.